In this video, we cover learning outcome number 3, which is all about different sampling methods. Our goal by the end of this video is that you'll be able to classify a sampling method as one of 7 types of sampling methods. The first sampling method is random sampling. And in this slide, we're going to define simple random samples and random samples. So first, I'll give you the 2 definitions. A simple random sample is a sample of size n, where n is some number, and it's selected in such a way that every possible sample of the same size has the same chance of being chosen. So let's say that there are 100 students, and we want to select a sample of 30 of those students. And if we're selecting 30 students in such a way that every single possible sample of 30 out of that 100 has exactly the same chance of being chosen, then that sample of 30 that we actually did end up choosing is called a simple random sample. So this group of 30 and this group of 30 and this group of 30 and all the possible groups of 30 have the exact same chance of being chosen. Then it's a simple random sample when we choose 30 of them, if that's true. Now, a random sample has a requirement that's similar, but it's not quite exactly the same. A random sample is a sample in which all members of the population have the same chance of being selected. Now, there's a very fine distinction there, and we can talk about it more during Zoom office hours if you'd like. But for our purposes in this class, whenever you hear simple random sample and random sample, they're pretty much going to be interchangeable. We're not going to get into that fine distinction between simple random samples and random samples. But the way I tend to think of it is just like pulling names out of a hat, being in a lottery, like that's a random sample. If you've got all 100 students that you're looking for and you have 100 names on cards and you have all those cards in a hat and you just pick out 30 of them, well, then that's going to be a random sampling. Now, most of the time in this class, when we use statistical tools, we're going to require that we have a simple random sample. And sometimes we don't have a simple random sample, but we still treat it like we had a simple random sample. So you want to keep that in mind whenever you're using statistical tools. Now, there are other types of sampling that are done all the time, and I'll outline those for you now. So one type of sampling is systematic sampling. So this is starting at some point and then selecting every kth element of the population. So maybe you've got a bunch of cars all lined up along the street, and you're just going to take every 3rd car. You have the 3rd car, and then the 6th car, and then the 9th car, and then the 12th car, until you get, I don't know, however many cars. That's systematic sampling. Or if you were to go through the phone book and choose every 5th phone number and call them, well then that's also systematic sampling. Or if you were to start at the 2nd phone number and then call the 7th and then call 5 more from that, the 12th, and then 5 more from that, the 17th, and so on. So you start at some place and then you just increase and increase and increase by the same number every time. That's systematic sampling. A convenient sample is just using data that are very easy to get. So if you've ever been to the mall and someone has said, hey, would you participate in this survey? They are using a convenient sampling. Or if you've ever just asked friends or relatives some question that you were curious about. You said, oh, what was the financial aid process like getting into college? And you just asked all the people that you knew that went to college. That would be a convenience sample. It's not necessarily representative, but at least you're able to get some opinions. You've got some data that are easy to get, but it's not necessarily representative of what's true and accurate in a larger population. Now, stratified sampling comes from subdividing the population into at least 2 different subgroups so that subjects within each subgroup share the same characteristics. So, for example, if you were to split everyone in the room by gender, just men and women, and then you were to select randomly from each subgroup, that's stratified sampling. Or if you were to separate everyone in the class by hair color or eye color, and then you were to randomly select people from the brown hair group and the blonde hair group and the red hair group and the other hair group, that would be stratified sampling. So you're splitting people into groups and you're picking or choosing randomly from within each subgroup. Now, cluster sampling is very similar, but it's different. Make sure you understand the difference between stratified sampling and cluster sampling. In cluster sampling, we're separating the entire population into sections as well. But then instead of sampling within each section, you're going to choose some of the sections. So instead of calling them sections, let's call them clusters. That's why they use the word, that's consistent with the term cluster sampling. What you do is you separate the population into clusters, and then you choose some clusters, and then you interview everyone within the cluster. So that's often what happens when we do the US Census. They pick certain neighborhoods and they interview everyone in the neighborhood, something like that. So that's cluster sampling. And multi-stage sampling is some combination of this. Pollsters often use multi-stage sampling in order to get results for like election polls and things like that. They don't use a simple random sample because that would be very expensive, but if they're able to use cluster sampling at some stages and stratified sampling at other stages, and they sort of mix all of that up in such a way that they get a certain result, or they mix all of that up in such a way that they think it's representative at the end, then that's a multi-stage sampling. You just do a combination of the types of sampling that we've just talked about. Now this slide has a lot of text on it, but I want to encourage you to just pause this video and take a look at these questions. These are questions that might appear on your homework. You're asked to identify the type of sampling method used, either random sample or simple random sample. We're going to think of those as the same category because we're not going to distinguish too much between the two in this course. Systematic sampling, convenience sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, or multi-stage sampling. So you might want to pause this and try to identify each sampling method used. Then we're going to go through all of these one by one, and I'll give you the answers. So here's a first one. The Cormorant bird population densities were studied by using the line transect method, with aircraft observers flying along the shoreline of Lake Huron and collecting sample data at intervals of 20 kilometers. Well, if they're collecting sample data at intervals of 20 kilometers, that's systematic sampling. Here's another one. It says the sexuality of women was studied based on sample data collected through 4,500 mailed responses from 100,000 questionnaires sent to women. So they sent out a bunch of questionnaires and then 4,500 women sent them back. What type of sampling method is that? Is it a random sample, systematic, convenience, stratified, cluster, or multi-stage? I think it's convenience because a bunch of questionnaires were sent out and whoever wanted to sent them back. That's a particular type of voluntary response sample. So that's a convenience sample, which isn't very representative of anything. It does tell you something about the type of women who would send it back, but it doesn't really tell you anything about the larger population of women. Here's another example. Mario Triola, the author of our textbook, surveyed a sample of his statistics students by identifying groups of males and females and then randomly selecting 5 students from each of those groups. So he got 5 males and 5 females. Well, he subdivided everyone first and then randomly selected, so that's a stratified sample. Here's another one. A student conducted a survey on driving habits by randomly selecting 3 different classes and surveying all of the students as they left those classes. So he chose 3 different classes from those that were being offered at his institution. And then he surveyed everyone within those groups. By subdividing first and then choosing everyone within a specific group, he's using a cluster sample. And then this last one, it says, your instructor was curious about how many of her engineering students actually used calculus in their careers as engineers. So she surveyed former students whenever she ran into them at TCC. So I meet a former student and I say, hey, did you use calculus in your career? Do you use it now? Is that random, systematic, convenient, stratified, cluster, or multistage? It feels random, but it's not a random sample. That's a convenient sample. I was just asking whoever I ran into. Now, we didn't do an example of all of these, but all of these may show up in your homework and all of these may show up on your exam. So make sure you're familiar with random samples, simple random samples, systematic sampling, convenient sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling, and multi-stage sampling. And be aware of the fact that most of the time in this course, we're going to assume we have a simple random sample so that the statistical methods we're going to attempt will apply to that sample.